Hi everyone, I'm Justin Weiss from IBM Research, and I'm excited to share our design fiction called Drinking Chai with Your AI Programming Partner. And what we try to do in this work is to uncover some interesting value tensions that arise with the proliferation of AI-based programming assistants. So I'll start by introducing three of the major ideas in our paper. First, our use of design fiction as a method of inquiry. Second, the context of generative AI. And third, the implications of generative AI on the future of software engineering work. Design fictions are a way to explore, speculate, and critically reflect on the future through scenarios or design artifacts. And in our case, we use a written narrative as our design artifact, which you can think of as a prototype of the future that was constructed through words. Researchers have used design fictions both to speculate about possible futures as well as to probe how people respond to those possible futures, and we do both of these in our work. Our specific focus is on the implications of generative AI on the future of software engineering work, but when I say generative AI, I really mean one specific aspect of how generative models are trained, called tokenization. In this process, data are carved up into a sequence of discrete tokens, and the model is trained to predict the next most likely token. This is essentially how a large language model works, where it's presented with a sequence of tokens as context, and the model is asked to predict the next token in the sequence. But instead of tokenizing data like written text, or maybe source code or images, what happens when a human worker's activities in the workplace can be tokenized and then predicted by an AI model? That's the driving question behind our paper. What are the implications of the tokenization of human work? And also, are there different consequences of this for the human workers versus the organizations they work for? We explored these questions using the concept of value tensions from value-sensitive design. Value tensions represent disagreements between different groups or constituencies in terms of what they value or what is important to them. In our design fiction, we focus on how the needs between workers and their company come into tension with each other. One tension revolves around the concept of human agency and who gets to decide what work to do, how that work is performed, and what a worker's right is to refuse decisions made by the company on their behalf. Now, let me walk you through the design fiction itself. So, there's three main characters. Tikani is a software engineer working in a large company, and the company's management has provided them with a generative AI agent to support their work, known as YPP for Your Programming Partner. In the story, YPP sometimes represents or enforces management's priorities about what Tikani does and how they do it. And finally, the third character is Yu, who was once Tikani's mentor and friend. The reason why Yu is shown as a robot here is because in the story, Yu accepted a buyout package from the company where he agreed to license his unique knowledge and work practices to the company so they could use it to train a virtual agent, which was called Virtual Yu. We wrote the design fiction in 13 chapters, and each chapter touched on one of three different themes. First, the idea of generative AI being used to tokenize human work. Second, the idea that generative AI, manifested by YPP, is used to impose corporate rules upon how work is completed. And third, the human's ability to refuse technology and resist corporate rules and priorities. So now I'll give a quick overview of the action in each chapter. In Chapter 1, we meet the principal characters of the story as I just described. In Chapter 2, Tikani uses YPP to analyze a code specification that they're working on, and YPP makes some recommendations. In Chapter 3, Tikani rejects part of YPP's recommendations, and instead they choose a different approach. Tikani ultimately decides to follow the work practices of his mentor Yu based on their previous relationship. In Chapter 4, YPP has already performed a partial tokenization of Tikani's work practices. This modeling allowed YPP to anticipate what software tools and environments Tikani would need for their work that day, and YPP saved Tikani both time and effort by providing those anticipated tools. In Chapter 5, YPP again saves Tikani time and effort by anticipating their needs. Tikani appreciates how well YPP is working, and in Chapter 6, they allow YPP to write the new code modules. Takani reviews YPP's code and makes some corrections. In Chapter 7, Takani realizes that YPP lacked an important piece of contextual information. Takani begins to rewrite the code using a software library that they like, but YPP reviews corporate rules and proposes a different software library that the company has standardized on. In Chapter 8, Takani reaches out to their colleagues to see what they think about YPP's recommendation, and Takani is convinced that their approach is better. However, the library Takani wants to use has a licensing cost to it, which would cost the company money. So in Chapter 9, YPP enforces corporate policy and requires Takani to complete a lengthy exception request if they really want to use the non-standard library. Takani doesn't want to be sanctioned by the company, so in Chapter 10, they agree to complete the paperwork. But here we see YPP is now actively interfering in how Takani wants to do their work. Takani becomes irritated with YPP's interruptions and extra administrative requirements. In Chapter 11, YPP again interrupts Takani's work with a buyout offer from the Human Resources Organization. Takani has the option to train a personalized generative AI agent with Takani's own ways of working. Takani will receive extra pay during the training period, but Takani must also agree to be terminated at the end of the training period. In effect, Takani is training their own replacement, which will become Virtual Takani. This is the same offer that you had previously accepted, leading to the Virtual You persona that Takani interacts with in the story. Virtual You provides Yu's technical knowledge, but not his warm and humorous friendship. In Chapter 12, Takani angrily rejects the buyout offer. And in Chapter 13, we finally learn why YPP has repeatedly requested Takani to drink chai throughout the story. CHI is actually an acronym for Computer-Human Adaptive Intracellular, a group of virobots that cross the blood-brain barrier in order to regulate each employee's affect toward high productivity. Takani is required to maintain a certain level of chai in their bloodstream at all times, and in the story, when Takani drinks the required dose of chai, they immediately feel much better about all of the problems that YPP has been imposing on them. Alright, now we've covered our use of design fiction to explore possible futures of work. Now we'll switch gears and talk about how we use the design fiction as a probe to gauge people's reactions to the idea of tokenizing human work activities. The way we did this was by recruiting 30 of our colleagues at IBM to read the story and fill out a survey where we asked questions about the different themes. All of our participants were involved in software engineering, design, or research, and most held an individual contributor role. About 70% of our participants identified as female, and everyone was compensated for their time. So what we did is took each chapter in the story and asked Likert scale ratings for 3 pairs of questions. First, what was the likelihood of the activities described in the chapter, both the scenario and the underlying technology required to make that scenario real? Second, what was the likelihood of the actions by the characters, both Takani and what the reader might do if placed in that scenario? And finally, who benefited in the chapter, Takani or the company? Participants rated these items on 6-point scales, and we used ANOVA tests to look for significant differences. And finally, we also invited participants to rewrite parts of the story if they felt like they should be different. So here's a chart showing participants' ratings for the likelihood of the scenario and technological features across each chapter. So each data point here corresponds to one of the 13 chapters. And overall, participants found both the scenarios and the technological features to be likely, which means our story does contain some degree of realism to it. However, the last chapters drop significantly in likelihood, which makes sense because that's where we introduce the more futuristic idea of virobots. One outlier here is in Chapter 12, where Takani refuses the buyout program. This scenario was plausible to participants, although the underlying technologies that enabled that scenario, not so much. This next chart shows the likelihood of the actions taken by Takani in each chapter, along with what the participant might have done. And in general, participants rated their own imagined responses as being tougher than Tikani's responses. Our participants thought that they'd be more strongly resistant to some of the rules and assistance offers by YPP, and we'll learn more about that resistance in a moment. And as with the previous chart, the ratings of plausibility dropped sharply around Chapter 11 when YPP offered Tokani the buyout program. Our last set of ratings asked who benefited in each chapter, and participants thought that the initial chapters described beneficial technologies and outcomes. And importantly, in these early chapters, participants saw benefits for both workers and for the company. But this pattern changes abruptly in Chapter 9 when YPP enforces company rules to override Tokani's choice of a software library. The benefits to the company decreased markedly, and the benefits to the employee fell to zero. And beyond this point, participants saw a clear value tension when the company attempted to enforce rules that Tokani objected to. The buyout program in Chapter 11 showed the greatest divergence of worker value versus company value. Also, both Chapter 11 with the buyout and Chapter 13 with the Vi robots were both rated significantly below neutral, indicating that participants felt the ideas in these two chapters went against the interests of both workers and management. So now let's look at the written material provided by our participants. We applied thematic analysis to analyze this data, and we constructed two primary themes: human control of the work and human displacement by generative AI and tokenization. And here's a few excerpts from participants' comments regarding the theme of human control. So participant 22 wrote that YPP should offer more nuanced options to Tokani. P8 appeared to agree, complaining of algorithmic micromanagement, and P26 also added that human judgment should be trusted over AI judgment. Now, regarding the theme of human displacement, P23 wanted Tokani to be the decision maker, rather than YPP imposing decisions. P26 criticized the fiction, saying that YPP had taken over most of the writing of code, thereby displacing the human from doing human work. And P15 added that this kind of displacement is disrespectful to the employee. Overall, our colleagues disapproved of many aspects of our fiction, and these two quotes do a good job of summarizing this criticism. P26 suggested that the situation was so bad that Tokani should consider quitting and finding work at a more human company. And P15 said that the virtual worker program would harm not only workers, but ultimately the company itself. So let's consider what this all means. Generative AI is often presented with a lot of enthusiasm in both the popular press and scholarly venues. We see a lot of hype, such as claims that generative AI can pass different kinds of certification exams, but then we see skepticism of those claims and sometimes retractions. But nonetheless, it seems like the core idea of tokenization of human work activities could be valuable, so long as it's used to support or augment, and not replace, human knowledge and human skills. We uncovered some interesting value tensions between the interests of the workers and the interests of their companies. Creating virtual equivalents of human workers would seem to benefit a company, but our participants felt that it would ultimately weaken them because some aspect of human learning and ingenuity would be lost, and the company would come to over-rely on their virtual workers. In academia, we often celebrate acts of refusal and decisions not to design or build technologies that could cause harms. And some examples of this are the feminist Manifest No and current calls for divestment. We note that Tokani experienced situations in which they were unable to refuse some of the company's requirements as imposed by YPP, such as drinking chai. We propose that we need more thought about the nuances of situated refusal, recognizing that refusing involves privilege, including the right or ability to refuse. So, to synthesize the ideas in our work, we propose three key concepts for workers and organizations. First, organizations may wish to rethink who has the privilege and authority to accept or refuse new technologies. Second, organizations may wish to adopt more flexible policies, especially with regard to enabling workers to make informed decisions about their own work. And finally, organizations may wish to support private discussions among workers for the betterment of workers and their organizations. Thanks so much for listening, and we'd love to know what you think.